Thank you so much, Sarah. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Well, first, I in turn would like to thank the organizers for putting this together. I think this is awesome, and may Allah reward you for all you've done. And we need we need this as Muslim lawyers, and we need community building amongst us. Let me pick up on the theme of these events, the space we occupy as Muslim lawyers, and Subhanallah. I would assume many of you, if not most of you, are too young to remember the 80s, to see so many Muslim lawyers or so many people that are entering the legal career is it's heartwarming, and it gives me hope for a different future for Muslims in the West. We have to remember that Islam, particularly Islam and the United States, it is not a recent phenomena. It is not a historical memory that can be measured in 20 years or 30 years, but there is a long history of Muslims being a part of the consciousness or the unconsciousness of America. And that there have been several waves of immigration to the United States. Of course, until 1965, there was substantial impediments to Muslims becoming U.S. citizens. That whether the quota system or citizenship laws that often barred Muslims from becoming citizens in the United States, but even before immigration, we cannot forget that Islam was a part of the reality of the United States, even going back to Native American populations and to slave populations. And there also the reality that is often rather uncomfortable is that successive waves of Muslims have come to the West, including the United States, and eventually became absorbed and vanished. Part of the and keep in mind that we are still unpacking the history of Islam in the U.S. In other words, there's still a critical amount of scholarship being developed about the history of Muslims in the Americas, Muslims and the United States, leave alone the bigger theme of Muslims in the West. So there's a lot to understand and a lot to study and a lot more work that can be done. But we do know that there has been a consistent trend for Muslims to eventually assimilate. I mean, and I don't like the word assimilation because it's not value neutral, but to become absorbed and eventually swallowed up, and lose their Islam in the West generally, but in the United States particularly. But yet we have, I mean, consider when I think back to the 80s, when I went to law school, the question that I most often got from fellow Muslims, and I'm one of those people. When I went to law school, I was not a U.S. citizen yet. I was a permanent resident, and I had sort of come to the conclusion that my law degree from back home didn't mean anything, and so I needed to become an American lawyer by pursuing a JD from scratch. And when I went to law school, I was the only Muslim in my law school. And the question that I would most often get from my fellow Muslims was, isn't it haram to study the law of to study kafir law? I hope that you guys don't get that question anymore. Uh, I think we've come considerable ways from that time, where people are asking whether a Muslim can be a lawyer, whether a Muslim can study American law. Yeah, it's. I remember that I would get into these at a time when every other Muslim that I would meet, they're going to medical school or engineering or computer science, and the idea of a Muslim studying law was sort of, oh well, you couldn't go to medical school, so that's why you're going to law school, right? Basically, law school is the evidence that you're a disappointment to your family and a disappointment to life. So that's why you're going to study kafir law. I was the only Muslim in my law school, and this was before the days of Islamophobia, but it was also, being the only Muslim, I felt a deep sense of isolation and otherness that was quite distinct. At the time, George Maqdisi was teaching at, who's a famous scholar who's written books like The Rise of Colleges in Islam and Rise of Humanism in Islam. But like a lot of scholars of Islam, unfortunately is himself not a Muslim, which is a persistent theme in our civilization in the West, right? Is that those who often study Islam are not Muslims. And I was quite, my happiness and my joy was to go attend classes with George Maqdisi, and every time I would step into law school, I would feel out of place because as a Muslim, I was out of place in my law school. I still remember my first year law school. I couldn't find a study group that would accept me because someone with a name like Khaled Abou El Fadl just didn't sound like he was at home studying American law. Eventually, when grades came out, that situation changed. I still remember when I often had to pray in the law school, and because of the number of times that my prayers were interrupted when people were not familiar with sujood or ruku', they just thought, they had no idea when they saw someone doing sujood in the library what it was, and they would often interrupt me to ask me if I'm okay. So I wrote up a sign that I would wear on my back as I prayed, and it said, "Muslim in prayer, please don't disturb." Some of the sweet law school memories, I guess. But I also remember something that probably is still part of our reality, that and definitely something that I experienced from a very different perspective as a law professor. But when I was still in first year, there was an incident, for instance, where someone or some people tore up my mail. We had folders that where mail for law students would be placed in these folders in a specific location of the law school. And someone tore up my mail and put a note, something to the effect about camel jockey, go back to your camels. And when I took it to the law school administration, and this is sort of one of these incidents that stay with you and become a source of deep reflection, right, for many years to come. When I went to the law school and showed them the note, of course they expressed deep sympathy. They felt horrible. They were very nice, but they didn't see any need to send a general note to the law school about tolerance and civility. 2 weeks later, after my meeting with law school administrators, someone put a swastika on the one of the Jewish students' locker. Drew a swastika, and it stayed in my memory how differently the law school reacted to a Muslim being told to go back to his camels compared to someone drawing a swastika on a Jewish student's locker. When that incident took place, the dean sent out an entire memo to the entire law school, informed the law school that we have zero tolerance, that anyone who that the law school is going to investigate this, and that if they discover who the perpetrator is, they will refer the matter to disciplinary actions. Very different than the way the law school chose to respond to me as a Muslim experiencing racism and prejudice. There are many memories but I go back to these memories to emphasize the point that I find it heartwarming that there are so many more Muslims entering the legal field, and there are so many more lawyers. And if there is something among the most distinctive features of the Western civilization in large, but the American civilization in particular, is the power of law and the extent to which law and the discipline of law opens up venues for a variety of projects, including the social and cultural identity of the nation in the nation that we live in. So let me go back. Let me go back to this issue of what space do Muslims occupy. It's one thing to think that our job is to help non-Muslims attain a familiarity with Islam. In this day and age, Islamophobia has become an inescapable reality. It's one thing to even attempt to counter Islamophobia, to, in other words, achieve a general basic civic familiarity with what a Muslim is and to aspire for a level of acceptance. That's one thing. It is also Yet another thing, that we believe that our mission is to get to associate ourselves with a body of law, inherited law, known as Shari'ah law, and to hope that we get this society with its institutional judicial structures to have the same attitude towards Sharia law that they would, for instance, towards Jewish law or towards any other foreign legal system. And that the sort of the height of our aspirations is that we are ambassadors for a historical legacy that we identify as Sharia law. But both these situations, whether we are just hoping for a better acceptance of ourselves as Muslims, a greater degree of civil tolerance, if you will, or if we are saying, please understand the historical reality of Sharia law and please don't be hostile to the historical reality, I submit to you that both of these, we still largely miss the boat. The reason I'm excited about more Muslims entering the legal field is not because I'm hoping that the West would be less hostile to Islam or to Muslims. And it's not because I am hoping that there would be a better implementation of Islamic law as a foreign legal system in conflict of law situations where an American court is applying some type of but beyond that, we have to understand that law in this society is a vehicle to power. And we have to matter in the political map of this country. And let me speak concretely here. We are all familiar, now that we, either you are lawyers or you will soon be lawyers, we are all familiar with the Muslim ban situation. We are all familiar with the Supreme Court decision in the Muslim ban situation. We can easily lose ourselves in the technicalities of the Supreme Court decision in the Muslim ban situation and whether the law is facially neutral or not facially neutral. But even as we speak, the engagement of the American legal system with Muslims, if you just do a general broad survey, it tells you, it speaks to us about the type of challenge that we confront and that type of challenge that we must meet. So just take the most recent dominant or just the most recent issues other than the Muslim ban and the Supreme Court in the Muslim ban situation. As we meet and speak as Muslim lawyers, it is significant that the most serious challenge to the American philosophy of civil rights occurred and is occurring on the platform in which Muslims exist. So take, for instance, very recently, the case of someone like Omar al-Baluchi. Omar al-Baluchi, a Kuwaiti citizen, who's detained in Guantanamo, who in Guantanamo sustained brain damage because of the way that he was treated as a Muslim. He was subjected to a procedure called walling, where you take a prisoner's head and you smash it against a wall. That Ammar al-Baluchi was tortured by an infamous CIA operative known as the Preacher. That the Preacher, while torturing Muslim prisoners, would constantly go off about Jesus Christ and salvation through Jesus Christ. That Ammar al-Baluchi, the torture of Ammar al-Baluchi was used to train other American investigators on torturing techniques. So in other words, his head was smashed against the wall often as a training prop. That before Ammar al-Baluchi, there was a man called Gul Rahman who was tortured to death in 2002. That no one was held responsible in any way for the death, in which the record is rather clear that he was tortured to death in American custody. That again, as we speak, we have a case like Majid Khan or Majid Khan. Majid Khan, for instance, another Muslim prisoner who was raped in American custody, hung from a ceiling, waterboarded, and again, Majid Khan, and I would submit to you, because he's Muslim, no one was held responsible. No one will be held responsible for the clear breach from everything that American law is supposed to represent. And isn't it significant that American law deviates radically from its own ideals when it comes to Muslims? Take the recent case of Abu Zubaydah, the recent Supreme Court case, where Abu Zubaydah is detained, taken to a black site, tortured in Poland and elsewhere. And the Supreme Court, in its recent decision, prevents the plaintiff's ability to compel testimony of two CIA contractors who played a direct and significant role in the mistreatment and torture of Abu Zubaydah, and yet the Supreme Court, in its recent decision, invokes the state secrets doctrine to effectively immunize CIA contractors from ever being forced to disclose what they know about Abu Zubaydah. I'll give you one more example. Many of us, I hope, are familiar with the NSEERS program, the National Security Entry Exit Registration System. About 1 million Muslims are placed or flagged in this program. And because of NSEERS, Muslims who are permanent residents who are foreign nationals and Muslims who are citizens are often interrogated when they leave the country and they attempt to re-enter the country, and their phones are examined, their apps are scrutinized, law and border agents will look at their correspondence, and as the recently filed lawsuit filed by the ACLU, the ACLU recently filed a lawsuit by 3 Muslims who were detained as they attempted to re-enter the country and questioned about their beliefs, their Islamic practices, what they think of Ibn Taymiyyah, whether they pray, what mosque they attend, etc., etc. So, on the one hand, right, we've come a long way from the time that I would have to hang a sign on my back saying, please don't disturb Muslim at prayer. But on the other hand, the reality is that there is something in the Western psyche, and indeed in the American psyche, that would like to keep Muslims boxed in with the exotic concept of Islamic law as foreign law. In other words, to look at you as a Muslim and say, well, this Muslim, either they do a technical job like a lot of lawyers who are technocrats do, wills and trusts, divorces, maybe commercial disputes with a provision in the contract as to the application of foreign law or something like that. Testifying as experts when it comes to technical issues of foreign law, but fundamentally remaining the other outside the normal consciousness of the West, because Islamic law is foreign, you as a Muslim, you are foreign, and it is to force you into the position of being like an artifact, a museum piece, to be observed but not engaged. On the one hand, we've come a long way by having all of you as Muslim lawyers. But on the other hand, consider this. In most of these lawsuits that I just mentioned, most of the situations in which battles over civil rights are being fought, directly involving Islam, Muslim identity, Muslim empowerment, Muslim agency, the lawyers that are involved are not Muslim. It is wonderful that the ACLU brings lawsuits on behalf of Muslims. It is wonderful that you find so many organizations deeply disturbed by Islamophobia and deeply disturbed by the way that the United States is betraying its ideals when it comes to Muslims. Because Muslims have become as if the living dead in the psyche of power makers. But where is Muslim agency? My dream is not to have the ACLU fight our battles. My dream is to have you fight our battles. My dream, and what should happen, is that all this critical body of Muslims, instead of worrying about explaining a foreign law to the American legal system or boxing themselves as experts in what is foreign, the other, taking on the causes in which Muslims are directly implicated. It is shameful that after we are now in 2022, we're a long way from the 80s, we've confronted something like Islamophobia, and yet we don't have a single truly powerful Muslim legal organization. We have several Muslim legal organizations that are like boutique shops that do more meeting than action. They meet together, they might have conversations together, they might claim to be involved in litigation, but actually making a difference in the world, in the map of law? No, we don't. We have a serious deficit in that most Muslims who go to law school become legal technocrats, and there are a group of Muslims who like to call themselves civil rights lawyers, but when you look at what they actually do, it is more for show than a reality. In other words, we Muslims have become very adept at putting on a show to impress each other. Look at me, I'm a civil rights lawyer, but what do you actually, how many cases have you actually argued before the Ninth Circuit, before the DC Circuit? How many cases have you actually argued before the Supreme Court? How many amicus briefs have you actually filed with the Supreme Court? What role did you actually play in sending the message to lawmakers and to judicial institutions in the United States that we Muslims matter? We are not simply here to be othered and to be observed and to be talked about, but we matter, and our identity matters, and our voice matters. Bring me to the final point and then I will stop. I have now been a law professor for 30 years. And during those 30 years, every year, there are more and more Muslims that enter the legal field. Over the course of these 30 years, we have now enough Muslims that come to just the UCLA Law School, that we have a Muslim Law Students Association, we have a Muslim Islamic Law Journal, Janelle, Journal of Islamic and Near Eastern Law, which has been in publication for 20 years. Every year there are a considerable number of Muslims who volunteer to work on that journal, to make sure that the journal continues to publish, and so on. We even have a prayer area at the law school, because we have a critical mass of Muslims. Over these 30 years, I have observed Islamophobia grow and become a beast, become truly a monster. While the number of Muslims in the legal field have increased, the power of Muslims in the legal field has not increased. And in part is that we continue to play a game of theater where our primary concern is to impress one another, to give the impression that we are doing something about, and here it's a critical distinction, that somehow if we serve Islamic law, if we pretend that we are experts in Islamic law, if we continue to give talks about how Shari'ah law is not that bad, it's not that foreign, it's not, that we are doing something, where you really make a difference is when you force the other to concede an agency to Muslims over their own identity. The issue is not for you to pretend that you are an expert in Islamic law and to get yourself in a position where you give the opening prayer in Congress. No, that is power that is handed over to you as a courtesy. And regardless of how much the other pretends that they respect your identity, unless you force them to concede power to your identity, they will not really respect it. It is quite another to look at the living issues that plague the Muslim community, to understand that as long as the United States keeps something like Guantanamo open, and all the occupants of Guantanamo are Muslim, and that as long as this reality continues, it has a direct bearing on all of us as Muslims, because it is part of how the United States conceives of Muslims' worth, understands the worth and the value of a Muslim. To think of something like the NSEERS program or the FBI's informants program or the New York City's spy program where they spied on all Islamic institutions, and to say, as Muslims in this country, we can't have others fight our battles for us. This is our own direct personal business. And in fact, Allah cares far more. Allah cares far more about what you as a Muslim do about the secret black sites in which Muslims are abducted and tortured all around the world. Allah cares far more about what you as a Muslim do about Jerusalem and Israeli apartheid. Allah cares far more about you as a Muslim and what you do about the Uyghurs in China. Far more about you as a Muslim and what you do about the Muslims of Kashmir or the Rohingyas than all the polite platitudes you can say about Sharia law. Allah is not impressed that you can put on a face as an Islamic law expert, brag about how often you're retained to testify as an expert in Islamic law. Okay, good for you, you're making money. Or that to convince a law school to allow you to teach a course as an adjunct professor in some American law school. No. What matters much more, is where our ummah is collectively. The Rohingyas, the Uyghurs, the Palestinians, Jerusalem, Al-Aqsa Mosque, Guantanamo, black sites. That's what matters. Well, I'm actually finished. And thank you very much.